So this is Rinal Parikh. Rinal is an artist from Philadelphia area, but what you're going to see in this beautiful work is all these references to her Eastern Indian culture and heritage, and many, many different techniques and things like that that reference that. However, you'll see that within this there are elements that really contemporary, that bring it up to contemporary painting and contemporary styles. So we'll see that as we go through. But I'm going to start with this because this is probably one of the most striking images. They're all quite beautiful, but this is what greets you when you come in. And it's just this huge, beautiful, large tree with all this, and you'll see flora and kind of fauna throughout all of her work, but all of these little references to rocks and plants and grasses, birds, monkeys, all of that kind of stuff, in very definitive style. So you can see here in some of the close-ups the repetition that's being used in the leaf structure, in the bark structure, all of that. And I believe, and we'll have to ask Rinal when she comes to talk to us, she's going to do a virtual presentation on October 2nd. But my understanding is that rather than a canvas back, I think there is a canvas on the back, this is also painted on handmade paper, if I'm not mistaken. I know the other prints are definitely handmade paper, but this has some paper behind it as well, I think. We're going to have to ask Rinal about that. But let's look at one of the other styles here that you see that is on paper. And again, referencing kind of the environment. So again, animals, flora, fauna. This particular style you can see down here is inspired by, I should have worn my other glasses, Madhubani and Kalamankari style folk art. So those are two of the references that you see in here. We will have a trifold for this exhibit that has a wonderful essay by Shilpi Chandra, who is an expert on Indian folk painting, and she talks about those traditional styles and how Rinal has really pulled out the traditions, but then manipulated them to actually focus on contemporary ideas and things that relate to her life here in the U.S. So you'll see some of that in the writing when that comes out as well, but really beautiful. And what you'll see here in the difference between these two is the use of color versus the traditional uses of color in this. And let's move on and look at a couple of the other paintings to give you guys some reference. So here we see that same style being applied. And what I really love about this is the detail. Again, you have the repetition, even though each one of these is individually created, the repetition of the flowers, of the leaves, all of that kind of stuff. But the beautiful use of color with the two blue jays right in the center just really make this pop and make this a beautiful piece of work. This again is in that same Madhubani and Kalamankari style folk art. And we'll see down here the same technique with an image of koi, of the goldfish in the pond. And the little bit that I know too, this representation of kind of the surface of the water with the little white lines, we're starting to see some of those Indian folk techniques come out again in this. The scales, all of the plant life that you see on this beautiful handmade paper. Quite gorgeous. I also like how this has been matted and framed with the use of the gold. It just gives it a richness and makes it really pop. And then here we come back to the Warli style, which is what we saw with the large painting to begin with. And we'll see this in the rest of the paintings in the exhibition. And again, the use of the repetitive pattern for all of the leaves on the tree, as well as the rays coming out from this down here to the grass, the birds. That repetitive style is indicative of Warli, but again, the positioning, all of the elements that you see, how she's adapted them to contemporary style, those are things that Shilpi talks about in her essay, and I find that really interesting to see how Rinal has kind of continued with the traditions but has really adapted and made them her own, and in such a beautiful way. I mean, this is something you might expect to see even in like the current Lord of the Rings series, all of that kind of stuff, the intricacy of this, and almost, in my mind, almost referencing textiles in some ways with the threads and the individual stitches. Here we see another Worley-inspired folk art piece with, again, referencing flora and fauna. So the tree image down here, all of the birds coming out of that, radiating out of it. And you get a sense of radiation from a lot of these things. So there's a central focus, usually a large tree, something like that, with things that radiate out from it. So those are some things that when Rinal has her lecture, I definitely want to come back to and talk about as well. One of the things that I find interesting in this piece is that use of those little line strikes. So those are indicating rain at this point, and how the repetition of those, how that took so much time for the artist to sit there and really do that. That, I think, is part of the creative process is important to this traditional folk art. And if I remember correctly, Rinal and Shilpi both said that these types of works are typically on walls of buildings, directly painted onto walls of buildings. Here we see them as canvases or directly on papers, things like that. So again, taking that folk tradition and applying it to a new technique, a new style. This is really lovely too. I love that one. So we've seen kind of the use of black and white. The other kind of tradition in here is this very, very muted dark green, and kind of we're seeing a little bit of the yellow-orange in here, but the greens and blues that we saw in the larger painting we see coming back here. But we see for the first time some figures, and I know family is very important to Rinal, and so you're starting to see kind of this idea of community with the figures around here, this idea of family. You also have the boats and the tents, all of those kinds of things relating to domestic activities that are important not only to the traditions of Indian folk painting, but to Rinal herself as someone who's now a resident of the U.S. and is raising her family, things like that, but also honoring those traditions that her family came from as well. So that blend of the two really coming out strongly, I think, in this particular work. So this show and the next one that we're going to see is going to close on the 6th. RBG stays up for about a week later, but we will have on the 6th, which is a Thursday, a reception both for this artist, for Rinal, as well as Leah Francis. So I encourage folks to come out for that. That's going to be from 5 to 7. Again, that's on a Thursday. It's free. It's open to the public. We'll have a lovely reception. We just had